Today we're going to go over optimal ranges, how they're derived, and why do we use them, or doctors like me use them to evaluate your lab work. So you see, most of the time, whenever you have your labs done, conventionally that is, the only time any of the markers that are discussed with you, they usually will have to fall outside of a lab reference range, right? They'll either have an H or an L by them, or maybe even one of those little alerts or warning signs, little caution sign next to it. That's typically the only time that marker is going to be discussed with you. Now, what we find, oftentimes patients come to the office and they'll say, hey, my lab work is normal, but why do I still feel like crap? And I think I'm going to be able to explain that to you by explaining the optimal ranges. How that you might fall, right? Your lab work might fall into a normal lab reference range, but you're not falling into that optimal range, and that's why you may be experiencing symptoms or not functioning optimally. Okay, so let's use this. We'll try to use this graph to show you how, first of all, how are the lab reference ranges derived. So let's pick LabCorp, Quest, really any lab for that matter. How they derive their reference ranges, they'll take a marker. Let's use glucose because we're going to use that in a minute. I'll show you that one. And they'll sample 5-10 million people, right? And that marker out of that sample group, they're all going to generally fall kind of in this bell curve right here in the middle. And then what they'll do is they'll take the top 5%, they'll call those high. They'll take the bottom right here, 5%, and call those low. So right here, this 5% is considered high, that 5% is considered low. So it leaves you about 90% of the population falling within the normal lab reference range. But we all know, certainly here in America, that 90% of the population shouldn't be falling in a normal range, right? So now at optimal, how that's derived, again, most of those, or a lot of the population is going to fall right at the top of this bell curve. So we want to use that. We want to use that population as considered more of our norm. So if you drop this line down, this will be our new cutoff for high. And if you drop this line down, this will now be our new cutoff for low. It doesn't mean if you fall in here that it's high, you have a disease, right? If you fall in this range, that doesn't mean you have a disease, but it's telling us you're trending towards pathology. You're certainly not functioning optimally. There's dysfunction, potentially going on, and you're trending towards those different pathologies or diseases. So to give you another example of how the lab reference range really shouldn't be used is if we use the glucose again. I don't have the patient, I wish I remembered years ago, but I had a patient that brought in their lab from a little lab in Louisiana, and their lab reference range for glucose was 85 to like 130, okay? Now, anything that's in certainly the 120s, or 126 is actually diabetic. Anything below that, between 100 and 126 is prediabetes, but they were considered, if you fell within that range, 85 to 130, that you were considered normal. So basically, as the population gets sicker, which it is, this bell curve is going to slide and going to move. So we're not going to be able to use that for, especially moving forward in the future, as a good tool to assess whether you're healthy or not. So we're going to stick with these optimal ranges. So let's use a live example. I'll show you some lab work. It's actually mine. So, okay, so let's use the glucose marker. So here's the glucose marker, 86, and then here from March. So this actually has I have two on here. So from March it was 90. So personally, my optimal that I like, an optimal range for glucose. So, well, let's go over the lab. Here's the lab reference range. You can be between 70 and 99. But optimally, I would like to see you between somewhere 85 and 95. Okay? So it doesn't mean if you're 96, you're diabetic, but we know you're starting to have what's called blood sugar dysregulation. You're certainly trending towards that. And if you're below 85, we know you're having some reactive, probably hypoglycemia, is the most common. There's other reasons, right? Those are just the most common. So again, it doesn't mean you have a disease, but we're going to start to really want to support you from a lifestyle standpoint. Maybe there's some nutrient deficiencies that could be leading to this. But certainly if you start to fall out of this range, that's what we want. We don't want to wait for you to get outside of a lab reference range and be already in a disease state, right? Now, some of you watching, this can change a little bit depending on your diet, right? So this is mainly for like the 99% of you watching this, but there are a few people that's going to fall outside of this range because they have a very strict adherence to, say, like a keto diet. If you're in ketosis most of the time, you're going to go usually below the 85 a lot of times because you're using fat for fuel, so you don't need as much glucose on board. And then kind of a different diet would be like very high protein, right? So like a carnivore diet, something that's very high in protein, you're going to run a little bit higher on the blood sugar, and that's okay as long as all of your other markers. So there's a whole slew of other markers on your lab work that we want to look at. As long as those fall in line, you know, there's some forgiveness we can give on the glucose. But again, like I said, for most of y'all watching, this is a good number for you to fall in between. That shows good blood sugar regulation and no blood sugar dysregulation. So let's go over let's pick another set of labs. So I'm going to put a patient up. I don't have their name, don't worry, their name's not on here. So right now we're going to go over a cholesterol panel, right? Well, this one looks a little different. This is probably not your standard. Most of you guys don't get this unless you, again, see me or a doctor like me. Typically what you're getting on your cholesterol panel is going to be this total cholesterol. You're going to get a total HDL, you're going to get the triglycerides, and you're going to get this calculated LDL. So you get those four things on a standard lipid panel. We'll go over in other videos. This will be a lot of information. But for these purposes, we want to look at cholesterol, right? So this person, I believe the gentleman, fell total cholesterol 185, right? So you would get a check mark. Conventionally, a check mark there would be good. Triglycerides, you wouldn't. So 293. So those are really high. So, you know, any doctor says, okay, that's no good. Certainly, the lab says, okay, you can go 0 to 149. Me, I like them to be less than 100, right? So I want you to be under 100. The lab says 0 to 149, but there's a lot of evidence, a lot of studies showing that if you go under 100, that you're more metabolically healthy, and we're not going to show any signs of insulin resistance. But let's move on to the HDL. Again, 35 low. For a male, you would want to be over 39 here, so 40 would be optimal. So at 35, which we would agree with, that's at this total cholesterol, 40 would be good. If you had a higher cholesterol, maybe if you had like a 220, we want to see the HDL get higher. There's another ratio we use. So just because you fall out of a lab reference range for cholesterol, it may not be a problem, right? There's other markers we can look at. Now, if you look at total LDL, again, this doesn't tell us the whole story, so it's 100. So in this lab, deemed at 100, they want you to be under 100, which, again, may or may not be important depending on what type of LDL you have. So there's LDL that is smaller and dense and very what they call atherogenic, be very damaging to your blood vessels and lead to plaques. But then you have what's called large buoyant, or what they call fluffy ones, that don't get oxidized. So there's no oxidation, or it's very little oxidation of the LDL, and it's very unlikely it's going to get stuck in the arterial wall and cause any sort of plaquing. But this is more important. So this is more telling here is a particle number size, because honestly, this is calculated anyway, so it's not even directly measured. But this is directly measured, is the particle number. So again, the particle number is, you know, more predictable of you having heart disease or any sort of cardiovascular disease. So again, this one is high, which we would agree with. But again, could be saved. This still could be okay if there was that many particles. But the size, let's say if the size was large enough, and that's what this is, this LDL size. So this person's here is 20.22, or I'm sorry, 20.2. They want you to be over 20.5. This person's going to fall in more of this B pattern, which we don't want. We want more of the A pattern. The A patterns are what we call the large, buoyant, or the fluffy ones that pose little risk to you. So this person, you know, again, there's several points to check to say, hey, does this check out? Is this high risk? I think eventually this person probably wouldn't have a lot of attention paid to them except for the high triglycerides. That'd be the only ding, because he falls at a 185 total. The LDL is really only at 100, so nobody's going to yell too much about that. The HDL is a little bit lower, again, but not too far out of range. But this one's more telling at this person's risk for cardiovascular disease is the particle number matched then by the size of that LDL particle. So kind of a double whammy there. This person, we happen to know why his lipid profile is shifted so far off, why his particle number is off, why the size of the LDL and weight is off, and that's due to insulin resistance. So you can see a little bit of this on this picture here, and we'll go over this in future videos, but he was very insulin resistant, not quite pre-diabetic or diabetic, but the insulin number off the chart. His insulin resistance score is high, and what insulin resistance does to the liver is cause a shift in, well, many things, metabolism, mainly, but it will shift your lipids off, because your liver is the main manufacturer of lipids, right? So out of all the cholesterol floating in your body, about 75% of it's manufactured by your liver. So whenever you have a disease or a process affecting your liver, you're going to definitely start to get a skew in your lipid profile. All right, I hope that helps. Again, like I said, stay tuned. We'll have more videos explaining all of these lab markers in more detail off of your basic lab work. I hope that helps.